For more than a century, the United States has relied on a distinct form of strategic signaling that blends military power with political messaging, a method commonly referred to as gunboat diplomacy. Although the term originates from the early 20th century, its underlying logic continues to shape U.S. foreign policy in the 21st century. The deployment of a modern carrier strike group, a floating fortress carrying thousands of personnel, dozens of advanced aircraft, and the most sophisticated naval technology on Earth, represents the contemporary expression of a tradition that once involved small gunboats patrolling distant coasts. The transformation of platforms has been dramatic. The transformation of strategic intent has not. Gunboat diplomacy in its original form was simple. Nations used visible naval power to intimidate, compel, or influence the political behavior of weaker states. The mere presence of a warship anchored offshore often achieved more than any diplomatic negotiation. It was a reminder that behind every polite conversation, every treaty, and every request stood a coercive force capable of imposing consequences. While the world has changed dramatically since those early days, this dynamic persists, especially in U.S. relations with states in the Western Hemisphere. The United States continues to rely on the assumption that overwhelming power, when displayed visibly and undeniably, can shape the decisions of foreign governments even before any military action occurs. In today's world, a U.S. aircraft carrier is not simply a ship, it is a strategic symbol. It represents the apex of American power projection capabilities, nuclear-powered engines, advanced radar networks, layers of escort vessels, missile defenses, electronic warfare platforms, and the ability to launch precision strikes across vast distances. When such a carrier sails into a region, it sends a message to every actor in that theater. The United States is watching. The United States is capable, and the United States is prepared to act. This message does not require a single missile to be fired. The presence alone reshapes political calculations. The logic behind this form of coercive power is rooted in a long-standing belief within American strategic circles that visible force deters aggression, discourages adversarial behavior, and compels compliance without the costs associated with full-scale conflict. The United States often views these deployments as a low-risk way to influence events abroad. A carrier strike group can arrive quickly, remain offshore without crossing political boundaries, and exert pressure without requiring boots on the ground. It is flexible, adaptable, and capable of escalating or de-escalating depending on circumstances. Yet, the logic of gunboat diplomacy assumes something very specific, that the target state recognizes the overwhelming power of the United States and interprets the deployment as intended. From Washington's perspective, the message is straightforward. We are stronger than you. We have the capacity to destroy your military infrastructure in days, perhaps hours. Therefore, you should adjust your political behavior accordingly. The assumption here is that rational actors, confronted with overwhelming force, will choose compliance rather than resistance. However, the effectiveness of gunboat diplomacy depends entirely on perception, interpretation, and psychological dynamics that are far more complex than many policymakers acknowledge. What appears as a signal of firmness from Washington may be interpreted as a prelude to invasion by adversaries. In many historical cases, states facing what they perceive as existential threats do not yield. They harden their defenses, mobilize their populations, and prepare for conflict. The United States, confident in its military superiority, often imagines that its actions will be understood precisely as intended. But international politics is rarely so predictable. In the case of Venezuela, this dynamic is particularly striking. When the United States deploys a nuclear-powered carrier strike group to the Caribbean, it is not subtle. It is the opposite of subtle. To policymakers in Washington, the message is simple: deter Caracas from provocative actions, pressure the regime to change course, and signal to external actors, Russia, Iran, China, that the United States will not tolerate foreign interference in the region. But for Venezuela, a government that believes itself the target of a long-term regime change strategy, the signal takes on a different meaning. Caracas interprets the deployment not as deterrence, but as coercion, not as stability, but as threat, and not as reassurance, but as proof that the United States is preparing for potential military action. This perception is amplified by decades of U.S. behavior in the hemisphere, interventions in the Dominican Republic, Grenada, Panama, covert operations in Chile, Nicaragua, Cuba, and political pressure campaigns across the region. From the perspective of Venezuelan leaders, particularly those within the Maduro government, the United States has demonstrated time and time again that it is willing to use force, directly or indirectly, to reshape political outcomes. Thus, the classic mechanism of gunboat diplomacy encounters a problem. Instead of compelling compliance, it may trigger defensive escalation. A state that believes its survival is at stake reacts not by submitting to external pressure, but by digging in. Instead of being intimidated, it becomes more resolved. Instead of yielding, it strengthens internal cohesion. This phenomenon has appeared in many historical cases where great powers attempted to use military signals to force political change. Iran during the tanker wars, Cuba during the missile crisis, Serbia during NATO's 1999 campaign, Iraq during the 1990s, when threatened with destruction. States often refuse to bend. The United States, however, continues to assume that military superiority is inherently persuasive. This belief is deeply ingrained in American strategic culture. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States has operated with unprecedented military dominance. It defeated Iraq in weeks in 1991, launched interventions in the Balkans with minimal opposition, removed the Taliban government quickly in 2001, and overthrew Saddam Hussein in a matter of weeks in 2003. These experiences reinforce the idea that American power is decisive, that adversaries cannot stand against the U.S. military, and that political outcomes can be engineered through limited use of force. But these historical episodes also mask a deeper truth. Rapid battlefield victories do not automatically translate into political success. Iraq fragmented into chaos. Afghanistan descended into a prolonged insurgency. Libya collapsed into civil war after the US-supported intervention. These outcomes reveal the limits of what military force can achieve. The United States can destroy military targets with extraordinary speed, but it has far less control over the political consequences of its actions. This is the central flaw in the logic of gunboat diplomacy today. It assumes that the mere presence of U.S. power will shape political outcomes, but it underestimates how modern states respond to coercion in a world where great power competition has returned. Unlike weak protectorates or isolated colonies of the early 20th century, contemporary adversaries are embedded in complex networks of alliances, economic ties, and ideological commitments. They understand that resistance, even against overwhelming force, may yield long-term benefits by rallying domestic support and attracting external assistance. Venezuela exemplifies this new environment. The country has cultivated relationships with Russia and Iran that provide diplomatic cover, military training, and intelligence support. China offers economic investment and technological infrastructure. These partnerships create strategic depth, making it far more difficult for U.S. coercion to isolate or destabilize the Venezuelan government. When a U.S. carrier group arrives offshore, Venezuela does not stand alone, it stands within a broader geopolitical framework that complicates the logic of intimidation. For the United States, the challenge is that the traditional tools of gunboat diplomacy no longer function as reliably as before. In a Cold War or unipolar context, the appearance of a U.S. carrier near a hostile coastline would have been a decisive signal. Few states would have risked escalation. Today, however, adversaries are more confident, more connected, and more experienced in countering U.S. pressure. They know that Washington is hesitant to launch large-scale invasions after the long, exhausting wars in the Middle East. They know that American public opinion is strongly opposed to new conflicts. They understand that U.S. administrations face domestic constraints that limit military options. This knowledge undermines the coercive value of U.S. deployments. A carrier strike group may demonstrate capability, but it does not guarantee willingness. And in coercive diplomacy, perceived willingness matters more than raw power. If an adversary doubts that the United States will take the final step, actual military action, then the coercive signal loses its impact. The threat becomes symbolic rather than strategic. Another dimension of gunboat diplomacy that complicates the Venezuelan crisis is the problem of signaling ambiguity. When the United States deploys overwhelming force, it intends to deter adversaries. But the adversary may interpret the action as preparation for imminent attack. This creates a classic security dilemma. One side acts defensively, but the other interprets it offensively. In this spiral of misinterpretation, even a precautionary deployment can trigger preemptive mobilization from the targeted state. This dynamic is dangerous because it increases the risk of unintended escalation. A misinterpreted maneuver, an accidental encounter at sea, or a political miscalculation could spark a crisis no side originally intended. Gunboat diplomacy is supposed to prevent war, but it can sometimes make war more likely by increasing tensions to the breaking point. Furthermore, the return of great power competition introduces new layers of complexity. Russia may view UU's deployments near Venezuela as part of a broader attempt to weaken Moscow's influence globally. Iran may see it as an extension of America's aggressive posture toward the Middle East. China may interpret it as a challenge to its expanding footprint in global resource markets. As these powers respond, even indirectly, they influence the regional balance, complicating America's strategic calculations. Gunboat diplomacy, once a relatively straightforward tool, becomes entangled in a wider geopolitical contest. A deployment meant to pressure Venezuela becomes a message to Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. Each of these actors interprets the move through its own strategic lens, potentially contributing to regional or global escalation. Finally, the use of overwhelming force as a political signal reflects a deeper structural belief within Washington's strategic culture that the United States, as a global military hegemon, must continually demonstrate its power to maintain credibility. This belief, the so-called credibility doctrine, drives deployments, not only for their tactical purpose, but for their symbolic value. American leaders fear that failing to respond forcefully in one region will embolden adversaries elsewhere. Thus, the decision to deploy a carrier strike group is rarely just about Venezuela. It is about Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, and every other state watching America's behavior. This mindset, however, creates a trap. The more the United States relies on military signaling to maintain global credibility, the more it becomes dependent on visible force projection. And the more it uses visible force projection, the greater the risk of miscalculation, escalation, and strategic overextension. Thus, gunboat diplomacy, intended as a low-cost tool for influence, gradually becomes a high-stakes mechanism that entangles the United States in crises far beyond its original intentions. In summary, the current U.S. deployment near Venezuela illustrates both the enduring logic and the inherent dangers of gunboat diplomacy. The United States continues to believe that visible military superiority can compel compliance, deter adversaries, and preserve stability. But the modern geopolitical environment complicates this belief. States facing existential threats do not yield. They resist. Regional alliances undermine the isolation necessary for coercion to work. Great power competition transforms local crises into global flashpoints. And the assumption that military dominance guarantees political control has proven increasingly flawed in the complex, multipolar world of 21st century. The United States still commands unmatched military power, but the ability to shape political outcomes through maritime displays of strength, the essence of gunboat diplomacy, is far less certain than it once was. The Venezuelan crisis highlights not only the persistence of this traditional tool, but also the limitations, risks, and unintended consequences that accompany it. One of the most persistent blind spots in U.S. foreign policy is the repeated failure to accurately understand how adversarial states interpret American pressure. This failure is especially visible in the case of Venezuela. Washington consistently assumes that its coercive measures, military deployments, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and intelligence operations will force political concessions or create fractures within the Venezuelan leadership. Yet the assumption behind this strategy reflects a profound misunderstanding of how the Maduro government perceives the crisis. For Caracas, the confrontation with the United States is not a diplomatic dispute. It is not a bargaining game. It is not even a geopolitical rivalry in the traditional sense. It is, fundamentally, a fight for regime survival. And when a state believes its survival is at stake, its political behavior follows a logic very different from what American policymakers expect. To understand this survival mindset, it is necessary to examine both the historical experiences of Venezuela and the broader psychological patterns observed in states facing existential threats. Throughout modern history, regimes under the shadow of potential external overthrow tend to become extremely resilient. They centralize decision-making, suppress internal dissent, and mobilize their populations around narratives of resistance and national sovereignty. These regimes operate with a heightened sense of political desperation, which paradoxically makes them more stable internally, even as they appear fragile from the outside. Acts of coercion, instead of destabilizing them, often strengthen them by validating their claims that powerful enemies seek their destruction. Venezuela fits this pattern perfectly. For nearly 2 decades, The governing elite in Caracas has constructed a political ideology built around the idea that foreign imperialism, particularly from the United States, is the central threat to the nation's independence. This narrative did not emerge in a vacuum. It was shaped by the long history of U.S. intervention in Latin America, the overthrow of Guatemala's government in 1954, the CIA operations in Chile in the 1970s, the Contra War in Nicaragua, the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, and the numerous military incursions in places like Grenada and Panama. These events are woven deeply into the political memory of Latin America and into the ideological identity of Venezuela's Bolivarian Revolution. For Venezuelan leaders, the United States is not merely another foreign actor. It is the classic external antagonist, the power historically associated with attempts to reshape or dominate the region. Thus, when Washington deploys military assets near Venezuelan territory or imposes sweeping economic sanctions, these actions confirm, rather than challenge, the regime's worldview. They become tangible evidence that the United States is indeed orchestrating a long-term strategy of regime change. And once a state believes regime change is the adversary's objective, all political calculations shift. In such situations, concession becomes dangerous because it signals weakness. Negotiation becomes perilous because it may be interpreted as vulnerability. And compliance becomes suicidal because it creates an open pathway for the adversary to intensify demands. The survival mindset instructs the regime that any compromise invites annihilation. The only viable strategy from Caracas's perspective is resistance, even if the costs are extraordinarily high. From the American perspective, this response appears irrational. Why would a state choose to endure economic collapse, infrastructural decay, and international isolation rather than make small concessions? Why would a leadership risk military confrontation rather than adjust its behavior? The answer lies in the psychology of political survival. When governments perceive existential danger, they evaluate risks differently from ordinary political actors. They believe that defeat means imprisonment, exile, or death. They believe that compromise accelerates collapse. And they believe that demonstrating resolve, no matter how costly, is the only way to deter the adversary. This logic is not unique to Venezuela. It was visible in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which resisted overwhelming pressure even when defeat was nearly guaranteed. It was visible in Iran during decades of sanctions and threats of regime change. It was visible in North Vietnam, which endured massive bombardment rather than submit to U.S. demands, and it was visible in Cuba, which survived decades of embargo and covert operations by rallying its population around anti-American nationalism. In each case, the United States misread the adversary's political psychology. It assumed that escalating pressure would weaken resolve, but the opposite occurred. Instead of yielding, the targeted regimes interpreted pressure as confirmation of their worst fears. The logic of survival pushed them to resist more fiercely. Venezuela follows the same pattern because the underlying strategic conditions are similar. A militarily stronger adversary threatening. A weaker state that believes its destruction is the ultimate goal. A crucial component of Venezuela's survival mindset is the consolidation of national identity around external threats. The Maduro government, and before it, the Chavez administration, framed their political project as a revolutionary struggle against imperialism. They cultivated an ideological environment in which resistance to the United States became synonymous with patriotism. In such a context, U.S. coercion strengthens the regime by giving it exactly what it needs: a visible enemy to unify the population and justify authoritarian measures. This dynamic is particularly effective during times of economic crisis. External pressure allows the government to blame national hardships not on internal mismanagement, but on foreign aggression. Scarcity becomes sabotage. Inflation becomes economic warfare. Sanctions become evidence that the enemy cannot defeat Venezuela through politics and must therefore resort to strangulation. This political narrative is powerful because it transforms failures into proof of righteousness. It turns suffering into sacrifice. It turns a struggling population into an ideological shield. Meanwhile, the survival mindset influences decision-making within the regime's leadership. When officials believe that the United States is seeking their overthrow, they have strong incentives to remain loyal. Defection becomes too dangerous. Compromise becomes betrayal. And internal dissent becomes a national security risk. In such an environment, political elites tend to unify rather than fragment. They share a common destiny: survival. This explains why U.S. policymakers, who expect sanctions and military threats to split the Venezuelan leadership, repeatedly fail to achieve their objectives. Instead of breaking, the elite circles tighten. Another dimension of the survival mindset is the use of asymmetric strategies. Confronted with a vastly superior military power, Venezuela avoids symmetrical confrontation. Instead, it prepares for prolonged resistance, dispersing military assets, decentralizing command structures, mobilizing militias, and integrating civilian networks into defense planning. These measures allow the regime to survive initial strikes and create a long, costly conflict for any invading force. The leadership understands that while it cannot defeat the United States militarily, it can impose unacceptable political costs by turning the conflict into a drawn-out struggle, the type of war the United States has repeatedly struggled to win. This approach mirrors the strategies used by Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, and other states that engaged the United States or its allies in asymmetric conflicts. These states recognized that the credibility of U.S. power declined sharply when quick victories prove elusive. Venezuela internalized these lessons. It knows it cannot defeat the United States in open combat, but it can ensure that victory will not be quick, clean, or politically sustainable. This knowledge emboldens the regime and fuels its survival mindset. Furthermore, Venezuela's alliances with Russia, Iran, and China play a crucial role in reinforcing the belief that resistance is viable. These external partners provide economic, technological, and diplomatic support that reduces the immediate impact of U.S. pressure. More importantly, they validate the regime's worldview that the United States will not succeed in isolating Venezuela, that the world is shifting toward multipolarity, and that American power is no longer absolute. These beliefs strengthen the survival mindset by reducing the sense of vulnerability and increasing confidence in long-term endurance. The psychological component of this mindset is fundamental. When regimes perceive themselves as historical actors engaged in a larger ideological struggle, they become more resilient than states motivated solely by material interests. The Venezuelan government portrays its confrontation with the United States as part of a global war between imperialism and sovereignty, between neoliberalism and socialism, between the global North and the global South. This narrative elevates the conflict beyond normal political disputes and transforms it into an existential mission. When leaders believe their survival is tied to historical purpose, they become extremely difficult to coerce. The United States, meanwhile, often fails to recognize that coercive signals are filtered through these ideological frameworks. Washington believes it is sending a message of dominance. Caracas interprets it as a message of impending aggression. Washington believes its power will intimidate. Caracas believes American threats confirm its identity as a revolutionary state resisting imperialism. The same action produces opposite reactions because the two sides inhabit different strategic realities. Another consequence of misreading the survival mindset is that U.S. policymakers underestimate the risks of escalation. They assume Venezuela will avoid actions that might provoke American intervention because American military power is overwhelming. But states under existential threat often behave unpredictably. They may take risks that appear irrational to outside observers, shooting down aircraft, mobilizing militias, seizing foreign assets, or appealing for military support from external allies. These actions stem from the belief that conflict is already unavoidable. When survival is on the line, deterrence loses its stabilizing effect. This is why U.S. strategies that rely heavily on coercion often fail. They rest on the assumption that adversaries prefer stability over confrontation. But survival-minded regimes do not prioritize stability. They prioritize resilience. They are willing to endure hardship, risk escalation, and resist overwhelming force because they believe the alternative is political death. This makes them uniquely dangerous and uniquely difficult to influence. In the case of Venezuela, this miscalculation is particularly costly. The United States repeatedly expects that sharper sanctions or more dramatic military signaling will force Maduro to negotiate or step aside. Yet these measures push the regime deeper into survival mode. The more pressure applied, the more entrenched the government becomes. The more Washington demands, the more Caracas resists. It is a cycle driven by fundamentally incompatible perceptions of threat. This dynamic illustrates a broader truth about international politics. The strength of a state's resolve often exceeds the strength of its military capabilities. Venezuela cannot match U.S. power, but it can match U.S. determination, and in conflicts shaped by political will rather than battlefield power, determination often decides outcomes. In summary, the United States repeatedly misreads Venezuela because it misunderstands the nature of the confrontation. It assumes a rational cost-benefit calculation, but Caracas operates under a survival mindset. It assumes pressure weakens regimes, but survival pressure strengthens them. It assumes adversaries fear escalation, but survival states expect escalation. It assumes compliance is the most likely response, but resistance becomes the only logical strategy. The failure to understand this mindset leads the United States into strategic errors, escalating crises that could have been managed differently and pursuing a coercive strategy destined to backfire. Venezuela's survival psychology makes it resistant to intimidation, vulnerable to misinterpretation, and capable of enduring levels of pressure that would overwhelm ordinary states. Until Washington recognizes this, its policy toward Venezuela will continue to operate on flawed assumptions, creating a widening gap between American intentions and Venezuelan responses, a gap that fuels instability, miscalculation, and the potential for conflict neither side originally intended.